Welcome to a brand new episode, and a brand new season of Searching for Sparks with Tim Motzer. And we're thrilled to have writer Stephen Rosen on today. And before I go in, I have to say that Stephen's writing through the decades of my life has really impacted not only me, but so many guitar players and music aficionados with his interview style. He's interviewed all the greats in rock guitar, and we're going to get into that right now with Stephen Rosen.
Hey, Tim.
Good morning.
Good morning to you, Tim.
It's good to meet you finally.
Yeah, man. Glad we could do this. Thank you for that sterling introduction there, man.
Well, it goes a lot further than that. It's like I think I started, playing guitar when I was 11. And not long after that, I got a subscription to Guitar Player magazine. So that magazine had such a profound impact on my knowledge, and now here we are in 2026. And the archives that you have of all these great guitarists that you've interviewed over the years, and really unique insight as well, I might add, that you don't catch that in a lot of journalism and music right now, So yes, thank you.
Well, that's very kind. I suppose it's like anything in life. When you're in that moment, you're sort of in that moment. So, I'm sitting across from Joe Perry, and there's a new Aerosmith record out, and that's what your focus is on. At least me, you have no sense of, well, yeah, 30 or 40 years later, is this story going to still resonate? Does anybody want to know about that? I mean, I guess if we had that knowledge, I could rule the world, but what you said, that Guitar Player was the sort of the defining publication for guitar players, and I was there at a pretty fertile moment in the development of guitar players and the electric guitar. And yeah, man, I was lucky to be there, and it was pretty remarkable for sure.
Amazing. And, I always think about this because, I love interviewing artists. I've been doing it since college radio and stuff like that. And one of the things that I always like to know is how did this all begin for you? Were you a musician and eventually just were really interested and fell into that somehow?
It was sort of a confluence of disparate elements, I would think. I was always an avid reader. I mean, I was reading lots of books and lots of magazines.
Yes.
I did start playing guitar pretty early, got little pickup bands with buddies and stuff. And really, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a guitar player in a rock and roll band. I mean, I sensed that early on. I could just never figure out, one, how to find like-minded people who understood that, were willing to work, wanted to work on original stuff. No, man, let's do a cover of the Stones. And I get all that. And of course, we all grow up doing that. But I don't know if it was the writer in me or whatever, but I was kind of writing these really horrible songs early on, and putting every word I knew into a lyric and blah, blah, blah. So it's a combination of being a guitar player, loving music. I was also listening to a lot of records. I had a huge record collection. I was collecting albums. So I think it was all of those things. I thought, well, music journalism, and it wasn't this specific, but I think about it now. I could write about music, maybe I could meet some of these guitar players. So it all kind of, came together really kind of organically. I hate to use that word, but it really wasn't a conscious effort. I want to be a music journalist, and that's how I'm going to make a living. I was in high school, and I wrote a column for my high school newspaper. The Centaurian, and I had a little, I thought I was so hip. The logo was like the Woodstock, guitar neck with the dove sitting on, And I reached out to these various clubs, the Troubadour and the Whiskey, and said, hey, I'm writing for my high school newspaper, and there's 1,700 students that go here, and they'll read my reviews and they'll come to your clubs. And all these guys opened the doors, you know. So I was able to see some remarkable shows at the Whiskey, the Allman Brothers. I saw Chicago early on, the Beach Boys. This is like 71. And, you know, the next day or the little review would come out, and everybody who never talked to me, I was never popular, and girls, and, you know, they come up and say, wow, man, I saw your little story and that was so cool. And I thought, well, you know, this is what I'm going to do. You know, I don't care if I ever make any money at it. I'm suppose that's the same, you know, impetus behind guitar players wanting to be in bands and, you know, meet women and this and that. At a point in time, it becomes about creating something. But yes, it kind of began there. And, you know, I kept sort of sending out stories and got little bits printed here and there. And ultimately, I make that leap to guitar player in 73. And, you know, it becomes a springboard like anything else. You have a resume and people feel they can count on you to go out there and get the interview and do a good job. So, yeah.
I think one of the things that has struck me over the years, because I'm an avid reader too, and I read so much and watch so many interviews, and you know, I've been doing this reading magazines forever as well. And one of the things about your style that I've always appreciated, and I feel that it got lost, was the actual interview, printing the interview. Here's what you ask, here's the answer. And I think you get so much more insight from that than an edited piece. To me, you know, it's like I feel like I'm there with you in your conversation.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think I probably, you know, yeah, every single word of an interview went to the magazines. Yeah. So if they edited anything, it was on their end. But yeah, everything, you know, good, bad, and the ugly. And, you know, I look back some of those interviews and I go, oh, why'd you ask that? And, you know, I'm pretty critical of what I've done. And, you know, oh my God, you're lucky the guy didn't walk out of the room. But you're right. You know, and what happens again, if we really move forward here several decades, that in-person interview doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
You know, right. You know, back in the day, you had all that machinery, which was good or bad, of the label and a publicist. And hey, you know, Peter Frampton's coming to town. You know, we've got him. You know, next Tuesday at the Hyatt House. You know, you want to go interview him. Now it's you know, it's a long distance thing. It's a phone call. It's a podcast, and certainly, you know, they have merit. I mean, you know, they can be amazing, but it's just different. I mean, when you're sitting in a room with somebody and you're breathing the same air, it's just, I don't know, man. I don't know if it's nostalgia or reality, but for me, sitting across that table was extraordinary because it wasn't too much later. I mean, I probably started writing about 72. Probably by the early, well, it was a while. By the early 90s, in-person interviews never happened. It was always a phoner.
Okay.
You know, artists weren't touring as much and labels weren't setting up those kinds of in-person interviews. Now, I'll be honest, on the other side of that, it was infinitely easier for me to do a phoner than have to go down somewhere and schlep myself. I mean, you know, all things being said, I mean, I wish that every interview I ever did was an in-person interview. It wasn't. Back to your point, the best interviews I ever did is when I'm sitting across the table from somebody. Absolutely. And yeah, it was amazing.
Well, you know, it's like I have a little bit of that insight from college radio, and I was a music director, and this was in Dayton, Ohio back then, and there was a jazz club, Jilly's, and they would bring everybody through. And I used to, you know, want to interview all my heroes, basically. So when Alan Holdsworth would come through, or whoever it might be, Jean-Luc Ponty, you know, I would go and sit with them, you know. But with Alan, you know, much like you with Eddie and so many other people, it became a hang, and you really got so much more insight from being around that person for a while and to see how they behaved and talk to other people and what they were interested in and stuff. And, which is leading me up to this phenomenal book where I would almost, after reading this book, I would describe you as Eddie's confidant in a way. Would you say that's true?
I love that word, Tim, and I love that you sort of gleaned that from the book. I don't want to anger anybody and, overstep my place in his life, but I think I really was, and he in many ways was that for me. I come with him, singing the blues or something, and Tone Chaser.
Tone Chaser. This is an amazing book, and we should talk about this. There's a lot to talk about, but Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah, Eddie Van Halen. He was a complex guy. He was not just this huge presence on a stage, strutting around like a king and this, $1 million smile. I mean, there was Edward Van Halen off stage and when he was home, and those are the moments that I wanted to write about, because everybody else saw him on stage and was running down every piece of gear and guitar he was playing in the studio. And those books were fantastic. That's not the book I wanted to write.
Yeah.
So when you say confidant, that's what it became. I mean, I never really thought of myself in that respect, not even in the writing of the book, but I realized that we shared some pretty personal moments, and I really believe he said things to me that he didn't say to other people. And I don't know if you have brothers or sisters, but you deal with them differently than we would even deal with your close friend, and sometimes you can say things to friends that you can't say to family. And I think that's what happened. So yes, I love the idea that I was his confidant, and if nothing more than just sitting there and listening to what he had to say and understanding that. Those are all the pieces I wanted to put in the book, and hopefully that did come across.
It came across to me, it's just like you have such a deep archive, very personal. And when I read the book, not only did I feel like I met Edward, in a deeper way, but I met you in a very deep way, because in that book, we get to read about what you were feeling, what you were thinking, your innermost thoughts. It's a lot of psychology going on in this book, I think.
That's great, man. Because when I first started writing the book, I was actually writing it in third person, so I was removed entirely. On February 6th, Edward was up at the studio, and a journalist came by and hung out. I mean, I started writing that, and it just didn't feel right. I go, this other person, who's this other writer, and a friend said, "Hey man, you were there, just write it in first person. You were there, So that's what happened. I tried to reveal as much about myself as I revealed about Edward, and I tried to be totally, and again, a little bit of an overused word, transparent, but
yes.
All the, my quirks and shortcomings and, blue moods. I mean, I had to write honestly about that stuff. And I had never read any other book that did that. You read a book written by tremendously gifted authors, about a musician or an actor, but you never sort of understand, well, I really love this actor, I love this music. They're always once removed. I go, I don't get that. You gotta, for me, it was putting everything in the mix. And I think that's what you touched on, Tim. And there were some innermost feelings and, me commenting on myself. I had this section in the book that I called notes. And that was sort of this omniscient person, this, individual who was much brighter than this Steve Rosen dude, looking down and say, Rosen, you are a fucking moron. Why would you have asked Edward that? And why did you act that way? And why did you respond? So I was, I had a chance to be my own critic before anybody else read the book. And when it was done, I thought, again, I've never read anybody doing this, but hey, it's my book and I'm going to do it. And,
I really appreciated that. I appreciated that a lot. And it's like, to have your point of view and your inner thoughts I think it's just like, a great interview. It's adding to it, because, I've felt those feelings too. I could relate, if you're interviewing someone, you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't ask that question. He doesn't want to talk about that topic or whatever. When you would go there, I could really relate to that. And it's, wow. That went on for how many years? It started in, I think, 1977, right?
That's correct. And the relationship through periods of up and down, and sections where Edward was on the road, until 2003. And it was really amazing. I mean, in writing the book, I can really look back and see what those highs and lows were for him. Mm-hmm. And, we all think, oh my God, you get more success and you're happier in your life. Man, that was just not the case. I've done enough interviews with artists, and they're always so fond of that first and second records because it was all so new to them, so they've waited their whole lifetime to record this first record. So they have all those songs stored up and they've been recording those songs live. And so it was that way with Edward. And even the second record. Look, I'm not saying that he, by the third album or the fourth album, he was like, oh man, I'm so tired of this. It was nothing like that.
Yeah.
But I could really sense, and I think my feelings were pretty accurate, that it was those first two records, those first two tours when he was happiest. And I wrote about that in Tone Chaser. For him, it was all new. This kid coming from, backyard parties in Pasadena where he grew up to playing the Whiskey, which was a huge step. And then going from the Whiskey to going out on the road, playing, opening for Montrose and Journey, these huge bands that he obviously knew about, recording a record. That must have been amazing, and his ascension was so swift.
It was.
That first tour and that first record come out. They're headlining their tours, that second tour, and he's become a legend already. But yeah, it was a pretty amazing period of time. Again, lightened and darkened by good and bad moments. So
yeah. I think that book illustrates the whole ride. It's a roller coaster, and and interpersonal relationships and all kinds of things going on in the band with singers and just all that, and him just wanting it to be great, and that struggle, that really comes across. And what a body of work in the end. And Edward influenced like everybody. Like, is there anyone that wasn't influenced by Edward, And his work aesthetic, it just seemed like he was an endless experimenter. And it's really just great to read your book and get inside his head and your head. So congratulations on that. It's really, really something. And almost 600 pages, I would say. So it took me a while to get through it, but I'm glad I did. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Tim. Again, I'm writing and I'm halfway, not even halfway through, and I'm at 300 pages. And most music biographies like that are 300 pages.
Yeah.
At that point, I thought, oh my God, what do I do? And again, I said, fuck it. It's my book. I'm going to write everything I can think of and remember. And hopefully people want to read it. Of course, I wanted people to read it. I don't believe anybody who writes books does it in a vacuum for themselves. I mean, some people may. I can't understand it because it's so much work. You want it to go out there. You want the response. But it was amazing. I mean, yeah, saying that stuff, and it wasn't a fluke that we look at him as Edward Van Halen. You talk about that work ethic. It was 24 hours a day. And it was constantly him with the guitar in his hand. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it was absolutely true.
Yes.
He lived and breathed it. And I mean, he earned every single accolade, So, yeah, I was lucky to be there. And I'm so happy that, obviously knowledgeable people like you responded to the book in that way. That's why I wrote the book, to honestly elicit that reaction. And I've been happy that most people have come away from the book looking at it that way. So
yeah, I think it's very positive and maybe definitive in a way, that other books aren't. And I've read a few other books about Edward as well, but this is just a unique slant, and I'd highly recommend it to everybody out there to dive in. I have another question about Van Halen today. Any comments about the bubblings about this new material and release? Because you probably talked about some of that in your book anyway. Just the endless recordings.
Yeah, certainly. And I heard some of them. Stuff that may be coming out next week, to be honest. Although maybe he may not. Yeah, probably. This is before I think he sort of like built the reel-to-reel vault, that we've seen photos of in 5150. But he had boxes. I mean, cardboard boxes. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tapes, because he recorded everything, as we all know. But I mean, he even recorded that stuff on tape, on cassettes. The couple of times I was with him and I jam with him. I say jam. Yeah. I sat there frozen, trying to keep my heart beating while I'm playing a guitar and he's playing bass. But he recorded them in his little boom boxes, and he gave me those cassettes.
Wow.
Which obviously priceless to me, but he recorded every single moment. So I don't know. I mean, who knows if any of that stuff that's on tapes has ever even been dumped digitally or onto CD. I would venture to say no. But in any way, in answer to your question, Tim, so we hear sort of different stories coming out, that Steve Lukather is going to come in and help finish some of those songs. Look, Luke was an incredibly close friend.
Yes.
If Edward was here and he heard that Luke was coming in to help put that stuff together, he would certainly give his assent. I don't know if Steve is actually coming in and hearing riffs that Edward played and Steve is going to replay them and interpret them.
I don't think so.
So what you're understanding is that basically there are kind of licks that Edward has, and Luke's going to come in and augment that stuff with some other parts. Is that what you understand, Tim?
From what I've read in the last week or so, it's more like Steve was interviewed about that he was coming in because Alex had mentioned it, and Steve was like, "Oh, if that's the case, yes, then I am, but I'm not going to play anything. I'm just co-producing and helping." And I think this is going to be just Edward and Alex and Edward's son, and they were looking for a singer. That's as much information as I've heard about. But I think Steve is going to be the person that's overseeing and helping it along,
And that makes complete sense. I mean, Luke revered Edward,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine anybody more capable of doing that. It
And
would
what
be, yeah, man. For me, and I'm probably a lone voice in the wilderness. I love, and maybe you do also, Tim. I mean, and I'm sure there's other people, but for me, I mean, it's like I hear like the Beatles outtakes on those anthology records, when it's like 30 seconds of a take of, Maxwell Silverhammer. To me, that's incredible. Don't do anything to it. There's wrong. I don't know. It's like they could take 100 rough bits, unfinished songs and put them on CD. And to me, that would be amazing. But that's me. People maybe want to hear more completed songs. They want to hear a singer. That's just me. So, finding the right singer. That's going to be a tough one. Wolf sings, right?
He does.
I mean, he's a really good singer. I mean, we're talking about 1 degree of separation here, so I don't know.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Look, I'm sure it's going to find a huge audience, and hearing some of that stuff.
People will be curious, no doubt.
Yeah, definitely. So,
well, not to digress from your book, but I just happen to know you've interviewed some of my favorite guitarists ever, and in fact, with some you went out on the road. So I know you have a few stories, and if we could have like a lightning round, I'll mention the guitar player, and you tell me like maybe a quick story. Firstly, Jimmy Page.
Jimmy Page, oh my God. Well, I'll tell you right now, the interview I did with Jimmy, which came out of me touring with Zeppelin in '77 for 11 days, became that cover in Guitar Player. I think came out at the end of '77. That story. That story, I've gotten more response from that story than any other story I ever did for Guitar Player. I mean, that was the one, So I had reached out to Page's management and the publicist literally for about a year. Hey, I want to come out on the road. I want to do this, Zeppelin famously hated journalists. Well, they're busy. No, they're not doing it. And they finally said yes. Swan Song said yes. So I go out and again, I spent 11 days with them in '77, stayed in the same hotel, flew on their plane, which was sick. They had their own bedrooms in the back. The plane was like fitted with like these like little sitting areas. Like there were no seats. It was just like these little cushions, so that was amazing. And I realized at that moment, and maybe it was the journalist in me, and I was by no means a professional journalist. I never had schooling, but I realized in that moment how important that interview was. I talked before about being in a moment, you don't think about what's coming, what might, how it might impact future readers. That one, I somehow understood. This is Guitar Player magazine. That was the biggest musicians magazine in the country. And this is fucking Jimmy Page. Yeah. And I thought, he may never do another interview like this in his life. And he didn't for many, many, many years. But even those interviews, he was always looking back at 1977. I was there, right? So I was only a few years removed from the first record and the second record and Houses of the Holy, blah, blah, blah. And so I wanted this to be like the greatest interview ever, So I sat and listened to every record and his history. And I had literally like 20 typewritten pages, pre-computer, mind you. And we sat down, and our first sitting was pretty weird. He was actually very nice, but he was fucked up.
Oh, yeah.
And then at one point he goes into the bathroom and he comes back out and he's even more fucked up. But that first sitting was great. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. And at one point, and this was fantastic, he goes, you know what? This interview, and I don't know if he used this word, but I'm paraphrasing. This interview is important and we're going to do this right. He understood what that moment was about as well. Well, that never quite happened. We finished the interview and it was good. I was able to interview him a second time while I was on the plane with them. And that was a tough one because Jimmy talks really softly and you can barely hear him, Plus he's got this thick Birmingham accent, and there's the white noise of the airplane, So I've got my microphone 2 inches from his mouth. And I want to speed this up because I know you have some other guitar players to talk about. So I'm talking to him for the second time, and I'm trying to get as much as I can. Somebody taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around. This is John Paul Jones, who I'd previously interviewed. I interviewed John Paul Jones before Page, and his interview was incredible. It's how I hoped that the interview with Page would have gone. I mean, we went over all his early sessions and, crossing paths with Jimmy. People don't understand that they knew each other. Yeah. It wasn't like, John Paul Jones, because John Paul Jones reached out to Jimmy. Jimmy did not reach out to John Paul Jones. And it's not like John Paul Jones reached out to this guy. Hey, Jimmy Page, I'm John Paul Jones. I'm looking for a gig,
Right.
They knew each other. Not intimately, but they did sessions together, Donovan sessions. I mean, remarkable sessions. So John Paul Jones is talking about all of that. The interview was amazing. He loved Zeppelin. He loved being in the band. All of that comes out. The tap on my shoulder. I turn on, it's John Paul Jones. And I look at him, and I go, hey, man, how you doing? And he taps me again. And I think he just wants to say hello or, hey, how's it going with Jimmy kind of a thing. And then he taps me again. And this time it's a little more ferociously. So I turn around and I stand up. And, he says, Rosen, you're a fucking piece of shit, you fucking cunt. And I'm thinking he's still goofing on me. He's still making fun of the American journalist on the road with Zeppelin. And I'm looking at him, and I'm speechless at that point because I figure he's still joking. But part of me was thinking, what if he's not joking? What is this about? I honestly didn't know. It was a really, an out-of-body experience. And he goes, you're a fucking piece of shit. I fucking hate you. You're not doing any fucking interviews. Give me the tapes. I pull out the tape that I'm recording with Jimmy. I give him the previous tape with Jimmy and the tapes I'd done with him. There were like 3 or 4 cassettes. Because I think I talked to him for about a couple hours. And I hand him the cassettes. And I'm trying to figure out what is going on. And I looked in his hand and rolled up. I need to backtrack just a little bit. Guitar Player had put together a compendium called Rock Guitars Volume 1. They put my Jeff Beck cover story on the cover of this. I brought copies to Jimmy and John Paul Jones thinking, it's like a peace offering. They both knew Jeff Beck. I thought, they'll both, like reading the story. And it'll prove my provenance a little bit. Hey, this Rosen has interviewed Jeff, and look at these other guitar players he interviewed. He's not some newbie out on the road with us. Then it dawned on me. That was the first story I'd ever written for a Guitar Player. In the opening paragraph, I wrote, of the 3 great English guitar players, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, and Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck has gone on to do amazing things. Eric Clapton has turned into a cowboy. I couldn't stand listening to Clapton's music sort of after Blind Faith, but for me, really, it was Cream. And Jimmy Page did nothing but copy Jeff Beck's first album. So John Paul Jones has read this after I interviewed him, telling him how much I loved being on the road with Zeppelin and how much I respected him. So he's thinking, this fucking journalist, he tells me all this stuff and then he writes this stuff. And that dawned on me in a second. So I sat back down and I'm thinking, oh my God, what do I do? We land. I could have stayed on the road probably indefinitely, which I should have done. I shouldn't have chickened out, but I realized at that point, no one's going to talk to me, right? Wow. So I literally booked a flight for later that morning. By the time we got back, they would fly on their own plane. So we flew back. I forget where the gig was, Chicago, St. Louis back to Chicago. By the time we landed, it's 4 a.m. I had a plane booked for like 7 a.m. to go back to California. Janine Safer, the publicist, saw what had gone on, right, for Swan Song, who was fantastic. She helped put all that together. She said, listen, go knock on John Paul's door and apologize. I go, I can't. I'm too embarrassed. I fucked up so badly. She said, go knock on his door. So I go knock on his door. It's like 5 o'clock in the morning, And he opens the door and he looks at me, and he's got that scowl on his face. And I go, I don't even have the words to apologize enough to you. What I wrote because it was my first story. I was trying to make a name for myself. It was the absolutely wrong thing to do. I love what you do. I think you're the most amazing, blah, 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 anything I could think of saying, And he hands me back the cassettes. And he goes, I still think you're a fucking piece of shit, but you have a job to do. And I'm not going to get in the way with that. I'll tell you, man, if that had been me on the other end, I would have said, fuck you. I'm going to burn your tapes. But he had, wow. I don't know, there was something in him. Fast forward a couple of months, Zeppelin are in town. Swan Song, one of the first bands signed to the Swan Song label. Detective. One of the first bands signed to the label are playing the Whiskey. John Paul Jones is there.
Wow.
Upstairs in the VIP lounge. I'm with my brother. I've told my brother this story about Zeppelin. He says, John Paul Jones is sitting behind you. I go, yeah, right, Mick. Right. Mick is goofing on me, He goes, he just stood up and he's walking over here. And I go, Mick, enough already, There's a tap on my shoulder. I turn around, it's John Paul Jones. I stand up. I'm thinking, oh my God, the guy's going to fucking punch me out. The story had already come out in Guitar Player. Page was the cover and John Paul Jones was the main feature. And it turned out really good. I mean, I wish I could have gotten more with Jimmy Page, but the story with John Paul Jones was really good. He looks at me and he goes, I read the stories you wrote and they were really good, and he kind of hugs me. Oh my God, this guy would do that, I mean, I think about it now. It really was a highlight for me, that I hadn't totally, fucked up entirely. So anyway, that's my Jimmy Page story. A lot more in there, but that's the essence. Yeah,
I know there is. And one thing that I wanted to add is I know that cover story and I've read it and it's been republished in some of Guitar Player's, I think the greatest guitar player compendiums or whatever. But, at the time that came out, there was no information like what you got on Jimmy Page. And I think you talked about tunings and miking the guitar and miking the amps. And, you got in there and it was like, we're all like all the guitarists, if I can speak for all of them, we were all like, oh my God, this is exciting, because they were it at that moment in time. 77 Zeppelin, that would have been Physical Graffiti, I believe. Exactly. Yeah.
That's so cool. Because again, I referenced earlier that I realized how important the interview was. And part of that certainly propelled me into try to getting all the details up. But even then, I was never cognizant of years later how important that interview was, because it was the first one who that revealed, what kind of strings he played and all of that stuff. I mean, I could have sat there and talked to him for 10 hours about the first record, but I realized, that I had to kind of get along with it, but I've had some other guys say, yeah, man, God, I didn't know that he played that Telecaster, and I thought that was still a Les Paul, and so hearing that stuff, I mean, I love that stuff, that kind of feedback.
Well, it's really funny to me because I'm not sure why this is, but early on, I think around the time that I first heard Jimi Hendrix, so I was probably in 6th grade or something. I was like, wow, who's this? And Jimmy, upon hearing Jimmy and some of the radio at that time, I got really attracted to all the English guitar players. I just started finding them one after another. Deep Purple was one of the early ones. Yeah. So Ritchie Blackmore would be the next one, I think.
Ritchie Blackmore. I was a huge Purple fan, but in fact, I remember this conversation. I had a buddy who had the first Purple record, which for me was one of the lesser records. They were still looking for their footing, you had a different singer. I think there was a different bass player in there. And he'd gotten this record and he loved it. He loved Purple, and I made some ridiculous comment. I remember it clearly. I go, well, I think they could do so much better. And so I didn't even know what I was saying. It's like, better than what? Rosen, can you play guitar like that guy? It was such a stupid thing to say. But I loved Purple. And in 74, I had a chance to go out and hang with them for a couple of days. Wow. That was the Burn tour, right, with David Coverdale, and Glenn Hughes. And the first time I interviewed Richie was backstage at a show. And backstage, as amazing as it is, it's not a place to do an interview. You know, right? And I don't care if you played 1,000 gigs, you're still warming up. There's an audience out there. And that's what Richie was doing. We were sort of like in this communal area. I remember he had a Strat on, and he had some little Fender amp, I remember he had his boot up on the amp, and he was just running through licks, and I'm standing there watching him, and oh my God, it was mesmerizing. Yes. And we start talking, and I'm asking him about Burn and some stuff, and then he, I asked him a question. He goes, well, the bag end from the forest is kind of in the trees, and you can't tell what you're seeing from Goldilocks, And I thought I was hearing things. I'm going, and so I nod like, oh yeah, I get it, Richie, And I asked him another question, and it was the same thing. And I realized, like, all his roadies around me are laughing, and I realized that it's nonsense. I realized later on it's this, like that limey slang. That they would speak to each other, but it just came out as he was just making fun of me and being sarcastic, And I said to him, I said, I flew a long way to talk to you, man, and I put a lot of questions together, and I don't know if I said I was insulted, but he got a little better, not much.
Yeah,
I was able to coax some stuff out of him.
Yeah.
Fast forward a year. He has left Purple, and he's now put together Rainbow. Mm-hmm. I drove out to his house in Oxnard, and he was pretty cool, because at this point, Rainbow's a new band, and he's thinking, oh, here's a writer, and maybe I better be nicer to him. So he was much nicer. Fast forward 2 more years or 3 years, I interview him for the cover of Guitar Player. And again, even for somebody like Ritchie Blackmore, and though he would never say it, being on the cover of Guitar Player magazine in the mid-'70s, man, that was a big deal. I mean, I don't care, right? I don't care if you were Blackmore or Clapton or Jimmy Page or Jeff Beck. And again, none of those guys would say that, but I know that it meant something to him.
Absolutely.
So he was really cool at that time.
That's
treated me really kindly. Yeah. And we talked about all kinds of things. But he was a weird guy. I interviewed him again a couple of times later, and I hadn't spoken to him a while, and I think my first comment was, yeah, I guess a lot has gone on. He goes, yeah, a lot has gone on. This is a phone interview, very sarcastically.
Yes.
And just real quickly to tie it into Edward Van Halen real quickly, Rainbow is playing at the Long Beach Arena, which is like about, 50 miles south of LA. And I knew Edward was a big Blackmore fan, so I invite Edward to go see Blackmore. I had backstage passes, so we go and see Blackmore. Afterwards, there's an after-hours party on the Queen Mary, which is like the huge ocean liner that had since gone to dry dock, and they had parties on it. You could do weddings, but they also had after-hours gigs, big gatherings in their ballrooms. So we go in, and I see Ritchie over there, and it wasn't too long after I did the Guitar Player interview, so I figured he would interview. I figured he would recognize me. So we walk over, and Edward is, walking alongside me, and Ritchie kind of sees me, and we shake hands. I go, "Oh, Ritchie, Steve Rosen, and I'm about to, say, Ritchie, this is," and Ritchie, kind of puts his hand up because, no, don't tell me. He looks at Edward and says, "You play guitar, don't you?" And I'm thinking, oh my fucking God, what did I do? I thought Ritchie would have been cooler than that. It was strange because if Ritchie Blackmore had done nothing more for me than, Burn, In Rock, Fireball, and Machine Head, that's all he ever needed to do. I mean, he had established himself. But I think that part of him looked at Edward, and he knew who Edward was, of course, as kind of like the Young Turk, right? And
yes.
Edward nipping at his heels. It was a really strange reaction.
Yeah.
But honestly, Ritchie was the kind of person where and I wrote about this in Tone Chaser, this line, that Ritchie was never unhappy unless everybody else around him was unhappy. I mean, even band members, Ian Gillan, could not stand him, and was happy when Ritchie left. It's a shame because I always thought that reunion the original, well, not the original band, but the Mach 2, John Lord,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Pace, Glenn Hughes, Roger Glover, Ian Pace, and Richie. Had they gotten together, I thought that could have been an amazing reunion. But Richie was not going to do it, and Richie's entitled to do anything he wants. He goes out there and does the most insipid Renaissance music I've ever heard. And, you listen to it and it's still Richie, and he still plays pretty amazing stuff on these lute type electric acoustic instruments. But it's like, God, just so turning your back on that place you came from. There's got to be something going on about why you would do that. Anyway, yeah, Richie Blackmore, another strange dude. But
yeah, I mean, from everything that I've ever read or even seen, him in the California Jam or whatever.
Yeah, right.
The word difficult is not the right word, but, he was a challenge to be around. And I think, when you meet your heroes sometimes and they're it's like, it almost like takes a little away from the art, So sometimes I've heard this said before, sometimes you don't want to meet your heroes, but, still, right. I'll hold him up there as one of the greatest of all times in rock guitar.
I'm sorry. Positively. And had he not, I think he just pissed off not only musicians, but media and press, because you see a list of the top 5 or 10 guitar players. Once in a while, he might be number 9, but he's rarely in the top 5. Yeah, to my mind, he's one of the greatest there ever was. Yeah. I mean, his tone, his technique, the way his strat, using that Revox reel to reel for his delays, treat it. I mean, my God, his Marshalls, nobody sounded like that.
Oh no, that's correct. Yeah.
Richie
Blackmore. Well, I don't know how much time you have, but Jeff Beck would be my third one.
Yeah. So Jeff Beck, again, in all pursuit of transparency, Jeff Beck was my favorite guitar player of all time. I think he's the greatest who ever lived.
He's amazing.
Right. He was the greatest. I think Jeff Beck, and I realize this is a weird sort of a existential comment to make. Jeff Beck could have played in Deep Purple. He could have played in King Crimson. He could have been in Yes. He could have been a jazz player a la Les Paul. He could have played straight up jazz, bebop. My God, he could do chicken picking, right? He could have been Albert Lee. He could do anything.
Yeah.
There were very few guitar players who could do that. He was just, you have guitar players today emulating. You have these Van Halen cover bands. You have Purple cover bands and Stones cover bands emulating Keith Richards and Rush cover bands. You don't see, in fact, I don't know of any, there probably are, Jeff Beck cover bands. I mean, his style was so impossibly difficult to emulate.
There's a couple that I know of on the East Coast. And the thing is you can't touch what he did.
No.
You can't. You can play the same notes, but you can never get to the soul. And just the way he played was so unique.
Absolutely. So I first meet Jeff, and I reference back to this Jeff Beck story that was on the cover of that compendium that got me into Led Zeppelin hell there. That was the first time I interviewed Jeff. And a publicist, her name was Lydia Woltag. She passed away, sadly. She worked for a company called Gibson and Stromberg. They were like the first rock and roll publicity company. And they handled Jeff Beck. They handled the Stones, a band called Black Kangaroo, with Jorma Kaukonen, the guy from the Airplanes' brother. Yeah. I realize these bands. I mean, I know I'm going a little astray here. Steely Dan. And I'd always wanted to write for Guitar Player. I thought, my God, if you could ever get a story in Guitar Player, Rosen, you could retire. And so they handled Jeff Beck, and I don't know how the conversation came up. Maybe I said, Beck is coming to town. That was the BVA then in 73. I love Jeff Beck. And she goes, well, maybe Guitar Player would want a story. I go, I didn't know what to say. There in her office, she called Guitar Player. She spoke with oh my God, I'm spacing out. The editor. I'm sorry, man. Senility. Oh God, Jim Crockett. I'm sorry, the editor.
Sorry.
Yeah. Right. Jim, we have this writer here, and he's going to interview Jeff Beck. Can you use his story? And so I can, silence. She hangs up. She goes, yes, Jim will read the story, and if he likes it, he'll print it. At that point in time, I thought, oh my God. So that's when I went home and listened to every, all the Yardbirds records, anything I could find. Jeff was staying at the Continental Hyatt House, which was sort of a famous hotel on the Sunset Strip, yes. Dubbed the Continental Riot House, because, all these bands coming over, they couldn't stay at any of these other hotels because the hotels knew that they were going to wreck the hotel rooms.
Yes.
The Continental Hyatt House, Riot House, embraced that. They said, hey, do whatever the fuck you want. Just pay us, just pay for damages, So anyway, so Jeff was staying there, and I knock on the door and, he answers the door. And honestly, I can remember later meeting Page, and that was amazing. I'd met Pete Townsend and Brian Wilson and Blackmore. Nothing was like meeting Beck. And maybe because it was before I interviewed these other guys, but he comes to the door, and he smiles and he's cool. And we sit down and we start talking, and he's just open and gracious. And I cannot believe this, I come to the end of the tape and I just rewind a little bit just to make sure the levels were okay. And there's nothing on the tape, So I go, I didn't rewind long enough. There's a leader, So I rewind a little more, and he's watching all of this, and there's still silence. And I rewind a little more, and it's silence. And it dawns on me that I fucking forgot to hit record. I hit play. You got to hit record and play, Tim. And nobody told me that. I mean, they did. He's looking at this, and I'm thinking, well, that's the end of my career.
Wow.
Gibson and Stromberg are not going to work with me anymore. Guitar player's not going to work with me anymore. And I'll be lucky if any other magazine, if they heard the story. Jeff Beck said, hey, listen, it's okay. Come back tomorrow and we'll go over it. Let's continue from here. From that moment forward, I loved him more than I loved him before. So we talked. The next day I came back. I had this really beautiful 1973 Maple Strat. And I brought it just so he could see it and play it, And he opens the case and he's playing it, and you can hear him playing on the cassette. Every time I listen to the cassette, and he goes, man, I love this guitar. I'm not going to give it back to you. For 3 cents, if he said, I was about to say, hey, man, you can have the guitar. I would have given him the guitar, So that was my first meeting with Jeff. I interviewed him in 75 for Blow by Blow, which I thought and still think is the greatest instrumental guitar record ever made. Fantastic. It set the stage, right? It's the first guitar instrumental record to break the top 10. It's the greatest display of guitar playing anybody has ever done to this day, for me, okay? I realize guys are going to say, oh, no, Steve Vai and Satriani and look, I get it. For me, it was that record. We got along. He remembered me. I saw some of those shows. 77, I wanted to write a book about Jeff Beck. I was approached by a Japanese magazine I was writing for called Player. They were the Japanese equivalent of Guitar Player, strictly a musician's magazine. They approached me, said, hey, we'd like a book on Jeff Beck. Would you like to write it? I go, oh my God, I'd love to write it. I start, doing interviews. I'd already interviewed a lot of people that Jeff had played with, right? Tim Bogert and Carmine Appice, Stevie Wonder when Stevie wrote Superstition for him. Stanley Clarke, Max Middleton, who was a keyboard player on Blow by Blow, who was brilliant.
I love Max.
There you go. A lot of musicians. And then I started, interviewing other musicians that I knew that he'd work with, and I reached out to Ernest Chapman, the manager, and I said, hi, Ernest, I'm working on a book. I would love to have Jeff's input, obviously I would have fallen over if it could have been an authorized biography. which I realized probably wasn't going to happen. But short of that, just having Jeff's input, allowing me to do some more interviews with him. And I still have the correspondence. I still have all these letters. And these are just letters in snail mail that went back and forth. And he would say at any given time, well, Jeff's, busy, but we're still thinking about it, and this went on for a very long time. At a point in time, I sort of committed to the book because I wanted to write the book. And yeah, it was sad that Jeff wasn't involved, but I thought I could put together a pretty interesting book. The book comes out in 78. I sent these 25 copies, So of course I scrambled to open it. And the first pages in the book are all of these photos of Jeff at his house. He had this big old mansion in England, and Jeff with his cars and Jeff with his guitars. And there's all this text. It's all in Japanese. And there's this other guy's name on the story. And this went on for like 15 or 20 pages. I'm going, what the fuck is this doing in my book? And it turns out that this guy, this Japanese person, had gone to Jeff's house, done all of this photography and wrote this text, and the Japanese put it in my book.
Wow.
Fast forward, Jeff sees this. He was unhappy. Years go by, and I never hear back from Jeff. I don't hear anything. I run into him in 83. Jeff is doing a special with Les Paul.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I run into, this is at Perkins Palace. He had done another one later on, but this is like the first one I think he did. I run into him. I go, hi, Jeff, what did you think? And he said, yeah, it was good. He said, you made me sound too nice. So I'm thinking, well, maybe he just didn't get back to me and everything was okay. Fast forward many years, I run into his photographer and he says, Jeff Beck fucking hates you, man. He fucking hates you. And I attributed it to this stuff that was in the book that I had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
I interview him right after that in 89 for the Guitar Shop record, which I thought was a really good record.
Right,
to my mind, it was kind of the last of the really good records he made. Look, he never made a bad record. He always played brilliantly. But I thought after that, it kind of, I don't know, it got a little too outside for me. Still, he played brilliantly. But I thought Guitar Shop was really incredible. And so I sat down and interviewed him, and I brought a copy of the book. And, I remember I thought he was going to say, you piece of shit, get out of here. But when those guys would do interviews, they had a schedule, 1 p.m., Steve Rosen, whatever magazine I was writing for. So he saw my name. He knew I was coming. So I figured if he was, willing to let me, at least come in and do the interview, he couldn't have hated me too much. So we sit down and I said, Jeff, would you sign the book? And he goes, best wishes, Jeff. We signed the book. We start talking. And he was a little distant. But honestly, that interview was amazing. I mean, we went back and talked about Wired and Blow by Blow and all these various side projects he had done, all the tracks on Guitar Shop. It was really good. So I don't know, man. I was just really confused. I tried to explain to him, Jeff, I had no idea of what that stuff was in there. You know, I apologize. And I wanted him to say, oh, I understand, everything's okay. And he never said that, but yet he never sort of got belligerent about it. So I suppose at the end of the day, I can only think that something I did offended him. I was never able to explain myself, but yes, Jeff Beck was the greatest who ever lived. And his listening was horrendous.
One of my favorite guitarists of all time as well. I love Jeff. I've seen him many times, and every single time I was just enthralled by his playing and his being.
Exactly. I mean, God, you even go back to those Yardbirds records.
Yeah.
God, the sound of his guitar, that Telecaster.
Yeah.
And the way he was playing the blues, and following, Clapton, who, I mean, Eric was pretty much a straight up blues player at that point. I mean, it was good. It just, it didn't move me a whole lot. And to see what Jeff did with all those blues, songs and steel blues and God, shapes of things.
Over, under, sideways, down, and just some of
God.
his inventions. He always had just amazing inventions. And even when we go to Blow by Blow, and
Exactly.
he's looking at things in a jazz way, and I think he was inspired to do that from listening to Miles. Some of the Miles Electric records, and where he went from there. Just even his last concerts were still like a tribute to Mahavishnu and things like that. And I loved his heart and his spirit. You could feel it. So that's amazing. You got to spend some time with him, and I'm sure he let everything go. He wasn't bothered by anything after a while.
Yeah. I hope so.
My final guitarist I wanted to ask you about, because I know you wrote a book about Black Sabbath, and that would be Tony Iommi, who also is one of the inventors of rock guitar, and heavy metal. So I'd love your insight on Tony.
Tony Iommi, I love Tony. Was probably the antithesis of these various guitar players you mentioned. He was the nicest person, so unlike that, kind of that dark countenance you saw on stage. God, he was just musicians from Birmingham. They have this remarkably dry sense of humor. Ozzy had it. Ozzy was a riot. My God, he was funny. And Tony had that same personality. You could just see how they got along for so many years. I mean, ultimately with Ozzy, it really had nothing to do with personalities. It was kind of the substance thing and the drinking that led to that band falling apart. But had that not happened, I think it would have remained that foursome till forever. Tony was incredible. He talks all about severing the tip off, and what he went through and how that created that Tony Iommi tone. I mean,
totally. Yeah.
Try to do that, put something on the end of your finger and just play it all. But the fact that he was able to fight through that and achieve that was amazing.
Really. Absolutely.
I loved him, I mentioned earlier, I sort of played in bands back in the day, and I was never a good guitar player. I mean, if I practice, I was probably okay. But Sabbath songs were songs that, you could play. You could cop a Tony Iommi riff and sort of, fake through one of his solos, So, that had a lot to do with it. They weren't these very complex, metal solos that you hear later on, and these riffs and these weird time things,
Yeah.
And really what Sabbath were, I mean, yes, they were a very heavy band. The sound of everything was heavy. But Ozzy's melodies, man, were really, they were very lyrical. They were very melodic, right?
Absolutely.
A lot of times they just followed the guitar lines. They weren't growled, but, Iron. I mean, that's just a, pretty, you could hear that in a, I don't know, some other band could take that melody. So I think that obviously added hugely to Ozzy's reputation as a singer and the legacy.
Yeah.
But Tony was fantastic. I ran into him several times, and I think we did some phone interviews, and I interviewed Tony for Guitar Player. And that was a great interview. I love Tony, amazing guy. The whole band was amazing. All the guys, Geezer and Bill Ward, very, very friendly dudes,
That's so good to hear that. That's the sense that I get from any of the interviews that I see, that they're a lot of fun. And I did read Tony's book, and I did read Geezer's book, and they're just hilarious, lots of great stories.
Yeah.
Well, my final question to you, as we wrap this up, would be, what's your view of the state of things in the music industry, and maybe in the world right now? How do you feel about everything
in the music industry? I think that the computer and the internet was the greatest and the worst thing that ever happened. For musicians. and now allowed you to, you can now go download an app and write songs. You didn't have the cost of going into a studio. You could, with a little bit of tweaking, you could go put your own website together and put your own music up there, which is great.
Yes.
On the other side of that, 10 million guitar players did that, and now sifting through all of that music to find what was good was really difficult. Look, were record labels good or bad, or did they care about the artist at all? I think they were all of those things. The label promoted the band. They put them on the road. They helped defray those expenses. Yes, the artist ultimately had to pay all that money back, but they did have the opportunity of going out there on the road and playing in front of people. And if the music merited it, get their music on the radio, sell some records. All of that went away with the internet. Labels no longer were signing bands. It was all DIY, do it yourself.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, for me, I don't think that the internet and the computer helped the artist any. I think the artist was now dependent on touring, and maybe that's a good thing. But if you weren't the kind of person to tour in support of your music, then you were kind of out of luck. So I think on that level, it didn't help. I don't know if bands took as much time to, and I could be entirely wrong, but to rehearse and woodshed and get your band together and play with each other. Again, a lot of that stuff happened long distance. And just like I felt it was important or maybe imperative to be in the same room with someone you were talking with, I always believed you had to be in the same room with someone you were playing music with. I'm not saying that those kinds of records haven't been made that are good, especially with good players, but there's something missing. I mean, you're never going to capture that excitement of,
oh, absolutely.
That the Truth album or the first Zeppelin record, or Who's Next, or any of those records that meant something to me. The State of the World, look, I think all you can do is wake up in the morning and do what you do and feel good about it, and hopefully all that stuff sorts itself out. I mean, I think if you dwell on it too much, you probably get a little depressed and a little sad. But I think the human race is resilient, and somewhere along the line, it all gets worked out. So we'll see.
We'll see. Steve, it's been such a great time hanging out, and new friends. I hope we will stay in touch.
Absolutely.
And I got to pick up some of your other books. I know I want to read that Sabbath book because, that one and the Jeff Beck, because of the times that they were written in. It's just like different insights of that period of time. So I look forward to both of those. Your new book, of course, I highly recommend it to everybody that tunes in. Get Tone Chaser. It's thick. It's great. And it needs to be read. And thanks for writing that.
Thank you so much, Tim. And just one little last plug here. If anybody's interested in the book, you can find it at tonechaserbook.com. One word, tonechaserbook.com. And it's different than the other Van Halen books. And I think Van Halen fans would dig it. So
absolutely.
Go buy it.
Indeed. Well, you have a great rest of your day. And I guess we'll be in touch at some point in time.
Absolutely. Many thanks, Tim. And I love speaking to somebody who understands the references and gets Black Kangaroo. So with that alone, we'll speak again. Thanks, pal.
This is Tim Motzer for Steve Rosen, Searching for Sparks, Episode 1, Season 3. You've been on it, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.